Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm looking today at the writings of Pankaj Mishra, who, if you haven't read From the Ruins of Empire and The Age of Anger and various other books by him, you're missing one of the key public intellectuals of our time. Somebody whose brilliantly eloquent writing and thought helps to provide a really good kind of means of navigating race, empire, and the post 9/11, and I guess the post 2008 world, even the post 2016 world in which we find ourselves in. His writing on Gaza, which I'm just beginning to explore, is really second to none. Particularly, he wrote a fantastic essay on Germany's deeply toxic relationship with Israel and the historical guilt and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that is enmeshed in all of that. But I definitely recommend you check out his work. Today I'm looking at an anthology of Pankaj Mishra's writing called The Bland Fanatics, which is his writing on Western liberalism. Um, and it's in large part is how Western liberalism is viewed in the global South, and Western liberalism, which kind of effectively markets itself in the West as the kind of the benign side of Western power, the side of John F. Kennedy and of NGOs and of the Bretton Woods institutions and of culture, things like the West Wing, for heaven's sakes. That world where after the two world wars, the idea of free markets and free individuals existing within a rules-based order that would maintain the world. This seems ultimately benign, but as Pankaj Mishra will point out in his essay, The Bland Fanatics, this is not how liberalism is seen in large parts of the global south. So, Pankaj Mishra writes, visiting Africa and Asia in the 1960s, Conor Cruise O'Brien is Irish internationalist, key figure in the United Nations, and a driving force behind the United Nations intervention in Congo in the 1960s. Conor Cruise O'Brien discovered that many people in former colonies were sickened by the word liberalism. They saw it as an ingratiating moral mask which a toughly acquisitive society wears before the world it robs. O'Brien, incurably liberal himself, at least in the early phase of his career, was dismayed. He couldn't understand why liberalism had come to be seen as an ideology of the rich, the elevation into universal values of codes which favoured the emergence and favour the continuance of capitalist society. This seemed to be too harsh a verdict on a set of ideas and dispositions that appeared to promote democratic government, constitutionalism, the rule of law, a minimal state, property rights, and self-regulating markets as the empowerment of the autonomous, rational individual. Liberal ideas in the West had emerged in a variety of political and economic settings in both Europe and North America. They originated in the Reformation's stress on individual responsibility and were shaped to fit the mould of the market freedoms that capitalism would need if it were to thrive. The right to private property and free labour, freedom from state regulation and taxation. They did not seem particularly liberal to the peoples subjugated by the British, French, and American imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Contradictions and elisions haunted the rhetoric of liberalism in the beginning. How is it, Samuel Johnson asked about secession-minded American colonists, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? John Stuart Mill credited India's free-trading British overlords with benign liberal intentions towards a people self-evidently incapable of self-rule. Despotism, he wrote, is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their government. Alexis de Tocqueville, by contrast, felt no need of the ingratiating moral mask. The French colonial project in Algeria was a glorious enterprise, a vital part of French nation building after decades of political turmoil. It's interesting to look at John Stuart Mill, the great sort of political reformer and philosopher of liberal thought in the 19th century. There's a great book which I recommend everybody look. It's quite short to read, but it's really a huge eye-opener, called The Intellectuals and the Masses by John Carey. And he makes the point that from the 1880s through to the 1930s, most of the literary and intellectual giants that Great Britain produced, and in fact, it covers the period the 1880s to the 1930s, but it begins further back. It begins in the 1840s and 50s with Dickens, who was a really quite a deeply racist individual when it came to talking about India particularly, and he believed after the mutiny that nothing short of the annihilation of the Indian people would satiate or satisfy the hurt to Britain's honour and all that kind of stuff. And so you have these figures, and again, the Intellectuals and the Masses is a great kind of eye-opener on this, from Dickens all the way through to Virginia Woolf, who, when you drill into their attitudes on empire and race and class, the kind of the liberal veneer really does melt away, and some deeply reactionary stuff exists behind it. And it's no surprise really that a quote unquote liberal hero like Mill says essentially, well, these people are barbarians, these savages, and despotism is fine for them as long as you get to governance at some point. His later kind of political ancestors are slightly notionally to the left, I mean not wildly, in the Fabians in the 1930s basically looked at the Soviet Union, and their justification for rather approving of Stalinism was essentially, well, these people are savages. They need to be knocked into line for several generations, and something good and mature and modern and nice will come from all of this. But if you have to break some skulls right now, well, so be it. They had no desire to see anything of the sort happen in Great Britain. The idea that Bolshevism happened in Britain was an anathema to the liberal left of the 1930s. But it's okay for Russians to endure and experience, which again, you cannot unpick the colonial attitudes and the colonial mindset from people living in colonial societies. Surprise, surprise. Even those who profess to have entirely different values. Pankaj Mishra writes, it wasn't only the entwined history of liberalism and imperialism that in the 1960s made many Asians and Africans suspect American and European liberals of being false friends. As O'Brien admitted during the Cold War, many Western liberals, such as those who were against imposing sanctions on South Africa, upheld the most illiberal forms of anti-communism. There was a great bit in the Great Fear, David Coates' history of the McCarthyite era, when he talked about Cold War liberals, the Cold War liberals, the Democrats who essentially bought into most of the kind of almost like the foreign policy aspects of the Cold War and McCarthyism. They were perhaps a little repulsed by Hollywood witch hunts, but they viewed the Soviet Union as a far greater threat to liberal democracy than McCarthy himself, which is true only geographically, I suppose. I mean, there was obviously no meaningful threat towards the United States for most of the Cold War from the Soviet Union itself, except from Cuba and occasional moments like that. But the thing about the Democrat Party and the wing of the Democrat Party that actually splinters off and joins the neoconservative movement later in the 1960s is that there is this trend from the end of the Second World War onwards of visceral anti-communism. And in a way, this was kind of liberalism in its own snare. Do we tolerate? Are we tolerant towards the kind of the intolerance? It's like Karl Popper's paradox of free speech. If we let the fascists speak, that they will eventually seize power and stop us from speaking. So we have to, gag the fascists. And the period from 1945 to about 1947 showed 1948 on the world scene and showed many American liberals that yes, this is you have to have a zero tolerance of policy towards the extremes of communism, and the as far as it relates to the global South, many of the emergent regimes in the global South aren't really particularly communist at all. These are national liberation movements that are easily tarred by the CIA and by the State Department as being communist governments. And that helps to motivate presidents various and helps to get the two houses of Congress to fall in behind various anti-communist crusades in South America, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia. Theorists who promoted free enterprise and equal rights as a formula for prosperity that all new nations could adopt often came from countries with long histories of economic protectionism and institutionalized racism. So countries that didn't do either of those things. The new post-colonial nations had their own alternatives to Western liberalism. Even non-communist countries such as India and South Korea put in place systems of government based on a mixture of central planning and market intervention. Raymond Aron, the French philosopher, worrying about the appeal of communism in Asia in the 1950s, suggested that non-liberal policies and institutions appealed to many state builders in Asia because it was clear to them that liberal methods in politics and economics were doomed to fail. There is such an enormous body of evidence to suggest this, and the explosion in poverty in the global South from the 1980s onwards is in effect the product of the structural adjustment programs, which was the injection of economic liberalism or neoliberalism into developing global South economies, leading to explosions in preventable illnesses and mortality from preventable illnesses, declines in education, and other public health measures, sanitation, that kind of thing. There was, I don't know if the final numbers have been crunched on how many people have died in the second half of the 20th century due to structural adjustment programs, but it surely is in the many, many millions. One only needs to look at the figures that we did recently on the podcast about the effect of sanctions to get a sense of what those kind of numbers would be. The collapse of communist regimes in 1989 emboldened the bland fanatics of Western civilization, as the resolutely anti-communist Reinhold Niebuhr called them, who regard the highly contingent achievements of our culture as the final form and norm of human existence. It wasn't too difficult for Cold War liberalism, defined and deformed by its ideological battle with communism, to reincarnate itself as neoliberalism. More than one influential Western commentator in the 1990s and the early 2000s outlined the new institutional framework within which latecomers to the modern world, without the benefits of slave ownership and colonialism, could achieve the virtues of individual liberty. Thomas Friedman's recommendations to the world's stragglers included the values of hard work, thrift, honesty, patience, and tenacity, as if countries in sub-Saharan Africa didn't do any of those things. They're laziness and dishonesty is the explanation for childhood malaria epidemics. These kinds of sort of ridiculous, preposterous, and frankly offensive positions that are taken by someone like Thomas Friedman, who is a historian and wonk right at the heart of the American foreign policy establishment, speaking with such extraordinary sort of ahistorical ignorance. It does kind of raise important questions about what it is foreign policy establishments in the Western world really know about the world, really understand about it, or do we have kind of cadres of highly paid and well-maintained apparatchiks who are capable of repeating the right-sounding sort of thing, but it has no actual bearing on anything whatsoever? I don't know. Perhaps we'll never know the answer to that one. And he also suggested export-oriented free market strategies based on privatization of state companies, deregulation of financial markets, currency adjustments, foreign direct investment, shrinking subsidies, lowering protectionist tariff barriers, and in the introduction of more flexible labour laws, or neo-colonialism. If you do the following things, have export-oriented free market strategies. Okay, I'll give you an example of an export-oriented free market strategy imposed on a third world country. Agricultural produce exported from Kenya. You can look in UK supermarkets, European supermarkets, perhaps even American supermarkets, I don't know, please write and let me know, and find things like green beans and asparagus that have been flown from Kenya as this kind of horrendous environmental crime. There are people employed by Tesco's. There was quite an infamous documentary done on this about 20 years ago, of who go to large farms in Kenya, often run by white people with black workers, and they bargain down the price they will pay per kilo of farm produce. Now, what does this tell us? It means that firstly, the buying power of Western supermarkets that monopolise this trade is sufficient that it manages to drive an eternally hard bargain. It means that export-oriented economies only export things that it's convenient for European countries and North American countries to import. If they started exporting high-end robotics and artificial intelligence microchips, you can imagine F-35s in the skies over Nairobi before you can say asparagus. In Quinn Slobodian's book, The Globalists, talking about the history of neoliberalism, intellectual history of neoliberalism, the point he makes in the book is that this version of the world was what people like Wilhelm Röpke, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek, that they saw global South countries slotting into this place. Well, you export the low end stuff for which you get pennies on the kilo, and import high end stuff, consumer goods and electronics and all these other kinds of things that where there is a large profit margins. And so you replicate post end of empire, you replicate imperial relations all over again. What was India doing during the rule of the British Empire? Exporting cash crops, cotton, indigo. And that's a large part of India's value, not exclusively. The British were able to exploit India in other ways, but it's a large part of India's value. And that's what its role was meant to be. And in a way, this version of liberalism, Cold War liberalism and neoliberalism, were imperialism by other means. The other things that Friedman is suggesting here, export-oriented free market strategies based on privatization of state companies. Privatization of state companies. Who buys a privatized water company, a privatized shipping company? Either foreign elites or domestic elites who are able to export the money out of the decolonized nation. And what doesn't happen is you don't get, and you haven't got, busy markets, busy sort of domestic share markets where ordinary working class Kenyans or Bolivians or whoever else manage to have a nice, attractive little portfolio of stocks and shares. It's about asset stripping. And here Friedman is making an argument for the asset strip, for global South countries to asset strip themselves.
One of the hardest parts of getting older is feeling like something's off in your body, but not knowing exactly what. It's not just aging, it's often your hormones too. When they fall out of balance, everything feels off. But here's the good news. This doesn't have to be the story of your next chapter. Hormone Harmony by Happy Mammoth is an herbal formula made with science-backed ingredients designed to fine-tune your hormones by balancing estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and even stress hormones like cortisol. It helps with common issues such as hot flashes, poor sleep, low energy, bloating, and more. With over 40,000 reviews and a bottle sold every 24 seconds, the results speak for themselves. A survey found 86% of women lost weight, 77% saw an improved mood, and 100% felt like themselves again. Start your next chapter feeling balanced and in control. For a limited time, get 15% off your entire first order at happymammoth.com with code NEXTCHAPTER at checkout. Visit happymammoth.com today and get your old self back naturally.
Currency adjustments. Foreign direct investment. So allowing foreign companies, and that which goes with currency adjustments. Currency adjustments make foreign direct investments easier, allowing multinational companies to come in on spending and buy up assets at fire sale prices. Shrinking subsidies, so removing subsidies from things like healthcare, from education, from housing, from food, but making people vulnerable to the whims of markets and the fluctuations of markets. And when we do that, what we really mean is, instead of making people vulnerable to the fluctuations of markets, we are, if you take away the word market, you're really talking about the person in the market who has the market power. So you are placing people, you're removing essentially social democracy and exposing people to the rigors of private wealth. You're replacing democracy with the rule of money. Lowering tariff barriers, so devastating domestic industries, and more flexible labour laws, giving people fewer job protections and rights. So these were the prescriptions that this is where the reason why Pankaj Mishra calls these people bland fanatics is that they seem, very dull, very plain. They're not marching around in uniforms and giving salutes and shouting. But the effect of their fanaticism, their liberal market fanaticism, is the impoverishment of entire populations, the devastation of entire populations, where a war hasn't happened, but it might as well have done, given the amounts of the numbers of fatalities, the illnesses, the collapsing infrastructure. And these were the kinds of things that were routinely in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, and perhaps still are, routinely recommended as prescriptions for this the interminable poverty of sub-Saharan African countries. And the large cause of that poverty really is the extraction, the repayment of debt. And as Noam Chomsky pointed out, debt itself is a kind of like a political construct. The people of Congo do not owe anybody the debts of President Mobutu. The people of the Philippines do not owe anybody debts accrued by the Marcos regime. And debt itself is simply, again, another device for the extraction of value by a rentier class. Anyway, rant over. The financial crisis of 2008 required Friedman's attention to redirected Friedman's attention to the manifold problems of rising inequality, debt, and the shrinking middle class in the US. Liberalism is deeply implicated in the crisis, as the path to it was laid by free market ideologues who demanded more liberty and less regulation from the state, as elected politicians removed all restraints on corporate greed. Unlike Edmund Fawcett, a former economist journalist who seems aware of its crisis of credibility, Alan Ryan and Larry Seidentrop continued to uphold liberalism as a universal ideology to which all political progress had been leading. The only morally acceptable form of democracy, Ryan writes, is liberal democracy. And liberalism gives the ordinary person a degree of intellectual, spiritual, and occupational freedom the ancient world never dreamed of. Seidentop is convinced that we in the West must shape the conversation of mankind, but that we must first understand the moral depth of our own tradition. The suspicion that Ryan and Seidentop are working with anachronistic assumptions derived from a sanguine 19th century philosophy of history and progress is deepened by their failure to even mention the current challenges to the West, to liberalism and to liberal democracy, the racist Republican right in America, and the quasi-fascist movements across Western Europe. The political landscape elsewhere, from Xi Jinping's China to Evo Morales' Bolivia, from Islamic State in Syria and Iraq to Thailand's monarchy-backed military despotism, features a variety of political forms, social movements, and political mobilizations, and looks further from Western liberalism than ever. Representative democracy and global capitalism were supposed to work hand in hand to usher barbarian peoples into a future of prosperity and stability, but have turned out to be deeply antagonistic to each other, even in India, where Western liberal democrats had long cherished as their most diligent apprentice in the East. So I think that the final point to make there that he's making, and I don't want this sort of episode to go on interminably because it's quite a long essay, and I will return to it, is that there are deep tensions between representative democracy and global capitalism. When you get a truly representative democracy, you tend to get some form of national movement in perhaps some form of national liberation movement if historical conditions particularly require it. These movements where people have normally fairly kind of similar sorts of needs, the need for a functioning society, the provision of basic services and goods, food, housing, water, utilities, transport, leisure, healthcare, all education for their children, all these kinds of things. Most people, wherever you look in modern history, are largely unconcerned about the kind of system that supplies those resources, as long as they are easily available, and that there aren't too many political, social, or economic costs as a result. However, the whims of global capital are such that when national liberation movements demand that certain populations are protected from the predations of capitalism, or that certain industries or national resources or infrastructure aren't up for sale or should be returned to the care of the nation, things like, for example, the Suez Canal, or water resources in India, then all of a sudden the forces of global capital become very much less well disposed to mass democracy. Democracy and capitalism have moments where they kind of coincide and coexist relatively harmoniously. But this often is the exception, not the rule. Capitalism is really a system of endless sort of self-accumulation. The purpose of capitalism is to keep metastasizing, to keep growing, and to keep finding new sources of profit extraction, value extraction. And democracy, in its various forms, is rarely about that. So part of the crisis of liberalism, which is a force that professes to set the individual free, and but more often than not sets money free, is that and it's a force that an ideology that presents itself, as most ideologies do, as the kind of the unifying and true global vision for the world. Its impact, its presence in the global south, is one that is experienced fundamentally differently to the experience of liberal democracy at the metropole. Here I am in the UK. I experience liberalism, or liberal democracy, whatever you want to call it, in a fundamentally different way, because I am in largely a more empowered position than people significantly poorer than me in other parts of the world, and people whose countries have had a history of colonization or neo-colonialism or contemporary kind of resource extraction. Anyway, food for thought. So I'll leave you there, but I'm going to return to Pankaj Mishra's essay a little bit more, perhaps tomorrow. But let me know what you think, and do check out the Substack, because we're in danger of growing into double figures in terms of subscribers soon. So that'll be a moment, why not? Anyway, thanks so much. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.